Welcome to Midnight Mysteries. If you feel like listening to a horror story, you're in the right place. It was a cold and stormy night at the end of autumn in 2001 when I approached the lighthouse in my small town, which had been out of use and abandoned for decades. The wind was furiously lashing against the cliff, and the waves crashed forcefully on the rocks below. The full moon, veiled by fast-moving clouds, intermittently illuminated the path leading to the lighthouse, a silent giant standing against the darkness of that night, lit only by the moon's glow and the lightning flashing across the sky. At the time, I was 25 years old and had a passion for photography, a passion that later turned into the job I enthusiastically do to this day. Back then, however, I had a particular attraction to mystery and abandoned buildings. That evening, my curiosity had led me to that isolated place, far from the lights and noise of the city. I felt the weight of solitude as I ventured inside the lighthouse. Its main door creaked and barely opened, turning on rusty hinges encrusted with weather and salt. The interior of the lighthouse was enveloped in almost absolute darkness. The beam of my flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing steps worn by the salty air and walls that seemed to weep with humidity. I began to climb the narrow spiral staircase, the sound of my steps echoing like a drum in that deserted structure. As I ascended the staircase, an instinctive, strange feeling grew. It seemed to me that I was being watched. Occasionally, a flash of moonlight filtered through the dirty windows, casting brief glimpses of what seemed to be old photos and equipment from the lighthouse, abandoned in a hurry. In reality, I didn't know the history of that lighthouse, and I had no idea why it had been abandoned and left there to be corroded by the salt. The wind whistled through the cracks, and at times, it seemed like I could hear real whispers carried by the gusts. Upon reaching the first level, I found myself in a room that must have been the keeper's quarters. An old table, overturned chairs, and an empty bookshelf. But what caught my attention was an old photograph on the wall, depicting a man in a keeper's uniform, with deep, expressive eyes that gave me a strange unease when I stared at them. I continued my ascent, feeling the weight of that gaze imprinted in my mind, as if I could feel it watching the back of my neck. Every step seemed to increase the sense of isolation and tension. The lighthouse structure seemed to breathe around me, its groans and creaks blending with the roar of the storm outside. On the second floor, the beam of my flashlight revealed a room that appeared to serve as an office. Scattered documents, yellowed papers, and old naval logistics books lay everywhere. In the center, a disordered desk with an oil lamp, now extinguished, as if someone had left in a hurry. I approached the desk, curiosity pushing me beyond the growing fear. Among the papers, I found a leather-bound diary. I cautiously opened it, and the flashlight illuminated pages filled with frantic notes. The keeper had written about strange phenomena, lights flickering in the sea at night, incomprehensible whispers, and shadows moving along the lighthouse walls. They seemed like the ravings of someone who had been forced to live in solitude for too long. I didn't give them much weight. However, as I flipped through the diary, the whispers carried by the wind seemed to intensify, as if I was disturbing something that preferred to remain hidden. A cold wind brushed the back of my neck, making me shudder. I looked around, but I was alone. I proceeded to the top floor, where the main feature of the lighthouse, its lantern, was located. Climbing those stairs felt like delving into the heart of the lighthouse, and each step brought me closer to something I couldn't explain. The wind howled furiously, and the rain battered against the windows like bullets. Once at the top, I stood before the lantern. now extinguished for years. The view from the top was breathtaking. The stormy sea stretched endlessly, illuminated by the intermittent light of the moon and lightning. At one point, while admiring that wonder, something caught my attention out of the corner of my eye. A reflection on one of the lantern windows. I saw a figure, a dark silhouette standing against the light. I turned sharply, but again, there was no one. When I looked back at the window, the figure had disappeared. A chill of terror ran down my spine. I was alone, in that lighthouse engulfed in pitch darkness at times, and those stories I had read in the diary had left their mark on me, making every little anomaly in that environment unsettling. My heart began to beat faster as I stood in the lantern room, trying to rationalize what I had just seen. Logic told me it was just a trick of the light and my imagination, but instinct cast out that there was something more. The feeling of being watched had become overwhelming, as if invisible eyes were fixed on me. I decided to go back down, but as I descended the stairs, every shadow seemed to come alive, swaying and contorting in impossible and unnatural ways. The beam of my flashlight flickered, as if it was about to die, uncontrollably increasing my anxiety. Every whisper of the wind felt like a murmur in my ear. Every raindrop against the glass seemed like the tapping of impatient fingers. Reaching the level with the keeper's room, I stopped, short of breath. The cold was penetrating, and for a moment, I thought I could see my own breath condense in front of me. Then, a dull noise made me turn. The office door had closed on its own. I approached, trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if it was blocked by an invisible force. A wave of panic washed over me. The entire structure seemed to tighten around me, and the air grew heavier. I headed for the stairs to descend to the ground floor, but I felt the floor vibrate beneath my feet, as if something was moving within the lighthouse. As I descended, the whispers intensified, transforming into voices I couldn't discern. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was urgent, almost desperate. I stopped occasionally, trying to locate the source, but the sound seemed to come from all directions. Once at the ground floor, I rushed towards the exit, but stopped at the last moment. In front of the door, a dark figure had appeared out of nowhere. It wasn't human. It was undefined, like a mass of shadows, with no distinct features, yet it occupied the entire space before me. I was paralyzed, unable to move or think. The figure didn't move, but its presence was oppressive, almost suffocating. There, in front of that dark figure, every fiber of my being wanted to flee, but I was glued to the ground. That thing seemed to float slightly, like a fragment of darkness detached from the night itself. An icy cold enveloped me, and a sense of despair overwhelmed me. It was as if that presence wanted to communicate something to me, but in a language I couldn't understand. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure dissolved into the air, leaving me alone in the dim light of the lighthouse. The tension suddenly released, and I was able to move again. Without hesitation, I headed for the door and stepped outside. The storm was still raging outside, but after the oppressive atmosphere of the lighthouse, the wind and rain seemed almost welcoming. I quickly moved away from the lighthouse, not daring to look back. With each step, the feeling of being watched slowly diminished but didn't disappear entirely. Reaching my car, I turned for one last look at the lighthouse. In the fury of the storm, it almost seemed like the building was trembling. I wondered what I had really encountered in there, and if it was just a product of my imagination, amplified by solitude and fear. Driving away, I knew that experience would haunt me. Even today, years later, every time I think of that night, a shiver runs down my spine, leaving me wondering what truly lurked within the walls of that abandoned place.